Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about your fantasy self and how to stop buying for them. I came across the idea of a fantasy self pretty recently, and it rang so true to me. So hopefully some of you find this relatable as well. By recognizing your fantasy self and how it impacts your buying habits, you'll be able to stop yourself from those impractical buys that just collect dust in your closet. So what exactly is a fantasy self? Well, this is the person that you envision yourself to be, but realistically just isn't you. For example, maybe you go kayaking with friends over the weekend, and you have so much fun that you decide that you are going to get into kayaking. You create this fantasy self of you getting really into kayaking and going out on the water a couple of times a week. So you end up buying a kayak because you envision yourself becoming this person, and maybe you use it once or twice, but over time it ends up collecting dust in your garage. Because realistically, you don't have the time to load up your kayak and drive to the nearest lake every chance you get and spend a couple of hours on the water. And just using this kayak maybe a couple of times a year isn't worth the investment that you initially put up for it. So it's important to recognize these buying habits when it comes to your fantasy self. For me personally, I used to struggle with my fantasy self when it came to buying things like clothes and makeup. It's just kind of a given for me that I like staying within a neutral color palette, and I'll only wear clothes that are comfy. So if clothes aren't comfortable or I don't feel confident in them, I'm just not going to wear them. But I used to buy clothes for my fantasy self, because my fantasy self would wear anything, no matter if it's comfortable or not. And as you might have guessed, I never touched these clothes. When it really came down to it, all I wanted to wear whenever I looked at my wardrobe in the morning was something comfy that I could just throw on and not have to think about. I also used to buy makeup with crazy colors that were way outside of my comfort zone, even though I only really liked wearing natural looking makeup. I have this one makeup palette in particular that I've only really used a couple of times because the colors are mostly yellows and pinks and things that I never really wear on a day-to-day basis. I think the main use I got out of this palette was using it for my makeup whenever I was cotton candy for Halloween. Another area that was a weak spot for my fantasy self was books. I used to buy so many books, and I would read most of them, but not all of them. I used to envision myself having a full library of books where I had read every single one of them. But now, realistically, I know that I don't want a bunch of books to lug around every time I have to move apartments. Now I only really buy books where I know that I'm going to have to reference them again. And if I want to read a book, I get it through the Libby app, through my local library, and I send it straight to my Kindle. I think the key takeaway here is that once you have a better sense of self, you'll be less likely to buy things for someone that you know you're not. For example, I know myself a lot better now than I did in my awkward teen years. I know what I'm comfortable wearing and what's practical for me, so I only buy items within that threshold. I'm all for investing in things that will get you to form a great habit or a creative hobby, but it's important to know yourself first and realize if this is something realistic for you that you can stick to and something that you will enjoy. So next time you're about to buy an item and you think you might be buying for your fantasy self, maybe try a few of these tips to decide whether or not that item is practical for you. So the first tip I have is to try before you buy. In general, I think 30 days is a pretty good amount of time to actually try something before you make investments into it. So for example, maybe you're interested in trying out some new interesting fitness classes like bar class, and you're really tempted to buy into the big expensive class package because you think just by buying it, that will motivate you to go. And even though these big packages usually are cheaper over time, if you end up going to the classes, if you don't end up going to these classes, this is an expense that you're going to regret. So maybe try doing some of these bar classes on YouTube, where you can try them out for free at home instead of committing to a huge package. Then you'll be able to decide if this is something that you realistically want to continue for a while. And this leads me into the next tip I have for you, which is building the habit first. Once you know that this hobby is something that you can realistically stick to, that's when you can start making investments into it. Like I said, I think a trial run of 30 days is a pretty good amount of time to decide whether or not this is something that's realistic for you. And we've all had workout routines, diets, and hobbies that we really thought we were going to get into, but haven't really stuck. So it's really important to make sure that habit is there first before you're pouring your money into something. The next tip I have for you is to borrow or rent instead of buy. For some things, you're absolutely going to need equipment to do the thing in the first place before you build the habit. So in this case, I would definitely recommend trying to borrow or rent the items before you make an investment into them. So if you really want to get into kayaking, maybe just try renting kayaks for the first month and see how that goes before you buy your own. A lot of stores have equipment for sports and camping that's available for rent to you. You could also just call around to friends and family and see if they have a kayak that you can borrow for the month. But if you absolutely must buy an item to experiment with your new habit, try and buy this secondhand. Thrift stores are a great place to check for these items, as well as spots like Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist. With these, you'll be able to get significant discounts on items that you'll need to build your habit, and maybe down the road you can upgrade if you feel that's necessary. The last tip I have for you is to start decluttering your fantasy self. It's really important to remember that just because you're acquiring all of this stuff for your fantasy self doesn't make that a reality. Most of the time, it just leads to a bunch of nice clutter that you never actually use. If you made an expensive fantasy self purchase a while ago that you never use, try and sell it for a profit instead of letting it just sit there and make you feel guilty for not using it. And don't just declutter so that you can free up more space to buy more things for your next fantasy self. Declutter so that you can start to gain a more realistic view of your true self so that you can make smarter buying decisions down the road. And those are all the tips I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please be sure to like and subscribe. I hope you'll have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.